Okay, now we are recording. So again, thank you all for being here. So a couple quick housekeeping items. If I can move here we go. If you could, please keep your microphone muted. If we end up having 153 people on, that's going to be a lot of people. So if you could keep the background noise down. I do have one of my wonderful Master Gardener volunteers, Susan, moderating. So she is going to help me out with that. Also, if you have questions this evening, please do place those in the chat. We're going to pause periodically and take a look at those. As I said, we are recording. Now we are recording. Also, if you hadn't had the chance, please fill out the pre-assessment. I gotta throw that Google form in the chat. So that just kind of gives me an idea of where everybody's at as far as their gardening experience and what they want to see from this webinar. I guess I should introduce myself. I don't think I've done that yet. But my name is Courtney. I am the horticulture educator in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. So my job, I am part of the extension service. And so I help homeowners and growers in the Cleveland County area with horticulture questions that they may have about their gardens or vegetable production, or sometimes even environmental things like composting or rain barrels. I also advise and help with our Master Gardener program. So we have about 100+ volunteers here in the community who help me with a lot of that work, disseminating that research-based extension-wide programming. And then I also teach classes, which I will admit that that's probably one of my favorite parts of my job. And I'm glad it's spring because I get to do that quite a bit. So I also want to mention that I am in Cleveland County, Oklahoma. So my gardening experience and knowledge is pretty centric to Central Oklahoma. So if you have questions from other states or other parts of the state, I will do my very best to get those answered. But just keep in mind, that's where I am and where my gardening experience is mostly from. So I wanted to share some of the survey results. I did this about 15 minutes ago. So if you just filled it out, I don't have it. So typically, if we were in a classroom, I'd ask everybody to raise your hands. How long have you been gardening? But instead, I'm going to copy and paste what I had from the survey. So about a little over half have been gardening of us tonight have been gardening for less than three or less years. So a lot of newbies, which is fantastic. That's what this webinar and this series is geared towards. We want to build that foundation so that you can have success as you garden for 5, 10, 15 plus years. We have quite a few seasoned gardeners, more veteran gardeners on here tonight as well. And so I hope that you learn something new or hear something you haven't thought about before. If you're anything like me, it is always good to have a refresher course. So I'm glad that you're with us as well. We also asked, what do you prefer to grow? And the most of us like to grow vegetables. I should have said edibles because it includes some fruit in there too. But most of us like to do it all. And I totally understand some people are not so much into the veggies, or maybe you're like, if I can't eat it, I don't want to mess with it. I totally get that. I was if I can't eat it, I don't want to mess with it for a long time. And then I worked at a garden center and the rest is history, and I do it all now. So we've got a good passionate mix here tonight. In a couple of questions, I wanted to show the spread about how confident we feel about gardening. And so a lot of us are pretty much in the middle. We had one very confident person. And so I hope that you're willing to share some of your expertise tonight with us as well. But if you don't feel confident at all, then you're in the right space. As far as troubleshooting some issues, again, we're all in a good space to learn, and then picking out some plants. It's kind of a spread of how we feel about that. So I just wanted to kind of give an idea of where everybody is and show your responses from that pre-assessment. So if you're new to gardening or you've been gardening for a while, you most likely know that it's a bit more than just putting the plant in the ground and then waiting for the rest to happen, right? It's not just that easy, where where the planting is the easy part, and it's the taking care of it afterwards that can sometimes have us pulling our hair out or shaking our head in frustration. So something to keep in mind, or something to kind of think about or approach from this perspective, is that plants, in a way, like us, are living, breathing, eating organisms. More or less. They can't necessarily get up and walk around like we can. They're stuck where they are. But they do have processes within them that are sort of synonymous with living, breathing, and eating. And when you start to think like that, then you can really sort of begin to tailor your management practices on those plants so that they have everything they need to be happy. And so for the first part of our webinar tonight, we are going to go through the circle of plant life and think about all those different stages of the plant to see how we can manage them at different times. So of course, going back to elementary school science, we start with the seed, right? So we plant the seed in the ground, and then the magic begins. And so if you're planting seeds, you want to make sure that the soil that you're starting them in, whether or not you're doing that outside in actual soil, or if you're doing that indoors trying to get transplants started in a potting media, you want to make sure that that soil is moist, but we don't want it to be overly soaking wet. And so without giving too many spoilers for next week, when we do talk about soils, soils contain pore spaces, and that pore space is either held up with a percentage of air and a percentage of water. And if we maximize the amount of water that we have in that pore space, then there's no oxygen for that plant to really be able to breathe, and the plant can suffocate. Essentially, it rots and it dies. And so sometimes when you're starting seeds at home, we tend to kill our transplants by too much love rather than not enough love. We overwater them. And so that's a common challenge or a common mistake we may run into, where we overwater our plants. And so want to make sure that we're not keeping it too moist. Another thing to keep in mind is that seeds only have a limited amount of energy to break through the soil. And so they're not photosynthesizing at that point. They're not creating their own energy. They have to depend on their energy reserves. And so that depends, how much energy they have is really kind of dependent upon how large that seed is. And so big seeds like okra or beans have a lot of energy, have a lot to be able to break through that soil. And so we can plant those seeds deeper. Now, if you have a very small seed, say like lettuce or carrots, those are very small seeds, and you barely want to brush them underneath the soil, because they have less energy to be able to push up. And so typically a rule of thumb for starting seeds and planting seeds is you want to go about 2 times the diameter of that seed. And so those very, very small seeds, essentially you can pretty much just brush them under the soil or sprinkle maybe like some sand over them, and that's really all they need. But larger seeds like those beans or peas or okra or corn, those all can be planted much deeper. And then of course this kind of makes sense, but we don't want to disturb that soil while those seeds are in their germination time. So they're very fragile. And so if you have, say you're trying to seed out some new fescue or Bermuda in a lawn area, you really want to minimize disturbance in that spot by not walking on it or messing with that soil. You want that soil to be as stable as possible during that germination time. So a little bit of seed anatomy. So this is a just kind of a typical diagram of a seed. We have the radicle. And so that is the undeveloped root. So the radicle will eventually shoot down and grow into your root system. The epicotyle is the young and undeveloped leaves. And so that's going to shoot above the soil and eventually become the part of the plant above the soil. The cotyledon, that is where the energy is stored. And so again, those larger seeds have a lot more energy and they're able to be planted deeper. And some seeds have a seed coat, which is just really a protective material. And so as those seeds begin to germinate, this is a cucurbit, which is like a squash or a pumpkin or cantaloupe. As they germinate, you can see that those young individual leaves, and it's shedding off its seed coat. So if you ever see that, that's what that is that seed coat being shed. So after this seed begins to germinate, like I said, the leaves emerge and the roots begin to grow down into the soil. And so these are the leaves that have the capacity to photosynthesize, which is essentially how plants make food for themselves. And so they are able to create sugar through that process of photosynthesis and be able to feed themselves. And then the roots, as they begin to grow down, not only do they anchor the plant, which if you're in Oklahoma, you definitely want your plants to have some anchors because it can get windy here. But as that plant anchors down, it also sort of serves as a sponge for water and nutrients within the soil. And so those roots are able to pull that up and be able to take that into the rest of the plant. And so we've got the sugar being produced on the top for that energy. And then we've got the water and the nutrients coming from the soil. And so to be able to move that to different parts of the plant, those resources are moved through the vascular system or the vascular tissue. So kind of like the veins within our body, that vascular tissue helps move those different resources. And so when talking about the vascular system, we really refer to two different types of tissue. We have the xylem and then we have the phloem. And so the xylem essentially moves from the roots up to the rest of the plant. And so as those roots are absorbing that water, absorbing those nutrients, they're able to push them up to the rest of the plant. And then the phloem, that carries that sugar produced by those leaves and is able to carry it to the rest of the plant. And so we say that moves from source to sink. And so source is where the photosynthesizing is happening, that magic's happening, but then we want to send that to areas where we need a lot of energy. And so that may be developing fruit, a developing flower, a growing point. All those places are sinks where we're trying to get that sugar to where the cells really need that energy to be able to grow quickly. So this is just kind of a cross section of what that vascular tissue looks like. So the vascular tissue is in some plants is around the perimeter of that of a stem. So this is a cross section of a stem. The xylem is on the outside, and then the phloem, let me make sure I said that right. And then I believe the phloem is on that inner side. So that's how excuse me, I think it's the phloem's on the outside and the xylem's on the inside. I'm catching myself on that one. And then in the inside, we can have pith, which is basically just a structural cell. Okay, so like I mentioned, so source to sink. So source, that's the leaves, that's where they're producing that energy. And then that sink, those are those specific areas where we need lots and lots of sugar, lots of energy to be able to grow. And so flowers, fruits, any growing points that we have is where that sugar is headed. So just some quick kind of definitions if you're reading about plants or plant parts. So a node, that is the point where a leaf is or was attached to a stem. So if you can see my cursor there, that is what we would refer to as a node. As it would make sense, an internode is the space in between those two nodes. A bud can be an undeveloped leaf, flower, or shoot, and we can have apical buds or axillary buds. So an apical bud would be one that is at the terminal part of that plant, where an axillary would be along that side of the plant. These are sometimes also referred to as meristems. And so meristems refers to a part of actively dividing cell tissue where we would have lots of growth, and that would definitely be a sink. And then we can also have the petiole, and so that would be that section that sort of attaches the leaf blade back to the stem. And so some plants have long petioles and some don't have very short petioles, but those are just a couple things to keep in mind when we're talking about plants. And so you can see this pretty well in a basil plant, these different parts. And so we would have this terminal bud here up at the top, and then the axillary buds, you see those developing there at the bottom. Now, if you think about the plant, and that plant's moving its sugars to the the most active growing part of that plant, that may be, in some plants, it's going to be the terminal bud or the terminal meristem of that plant. And so in some plants, especially basil, my example here, it can be a good idea to go ahead and pinch some of those terminal meristems off, because then the axillary buds, those axillary meristems, take over and become more dominant, and you end up with bushier plants. And so that can sometimes be a strategy to get bushier plants, is to take off those terminal meristems so that the plants can't send their energy to those spots anymore, and they focus on that branchy growth instead of that leggy growth. You'll also notice too, if you've ever grown cabbage or Brussels sprouts, so something to kind of think in mind, that cabbage is a swollen terminal bud. The whole plant, that's what you're eating. You are eating a giant swollen terminal bud. Now, if you're eating Brussels sprouts, which they say like cabbage's little baby cousin, you're eating a swollen axillary bud when you're eating Brussels sprouts. So just kind of a fun thing to note there. And then two, if you're ever talking about propagation or trying to take cuttings of plants, you may read that you want to have some exposed nodes on your cutting. And so if you were to take this particular plant here and there were no nodes, it wouldn't then be able to create adventitious roots. And so if you take a cutting, you want to definitely make sure you have those nodes, because this cell tissue right here has the capability to produce roots when put into a different environment. And so if you put that into soil, or sometimes even you can put it into water, but you don't want to do that for too long, because remember, we don't want to suffocate it. You start to get these adventitious roots, and you can grow another plant or another clone from whatever you take your cutting from. So that's just something to keep in mind as well when talking about different plant parts. So after the plants begin to grow, the next stage in the plant life cycle, the flowers begin to appear. And so we may think flowers as these beautiful, lovely things that we want to have in our garden, and they're gorgeous, they make us happy. But the plant's really just there to make flowers because its function is reproduction. And so that's why that is the goal with creation of flowers for plants. And sometimes a flower isn't necessarily just a flower, one singular flower, but it can be a group of flowers. And so if you think of like maybe like a lantana or pentas, which is another bedding plant annual, those are all tiny little flowers clustered together to make what looks like one large flower. And when it's a cluster of small little flowers, we refer to that as an inflorescence. And then of course, after the flowers appear, we have pollination, and that then creates seeds, which are the next generation of plants. And so if we're to look at the anatomy of a flower, we have the peduncle, which is kind of like the petiole, except for a flower. We have the sepals, and the sepals are sort of an outside protective petal, not always necessarily showy, but that protect that flower until it opens up. We have the petal, which can be the showy part of the plant. We have the stamen, which is the male and the pollen producing part of the plant, and that's made of the filament, which is the stalk, and then the anther, which is the pollen producing part of the plant. And then we have the pistil, which is the female part of the plant. And so we have the ovary, that's what eventually will develop into fruit. We have the style, which is sort of like a long tube, and then the stigma, which is where the pollen lands, and the pollen will grow all the way down through the style to join with the ovule. And then we have, so as I mentioned, we can have inflorescences, and so we can also have different types of inflorescences. And so a solitary, that would be just considered a flower, but all these other flowers are considered inflorescences. And so you may see like spikes, so like salvia, that'd be an example of a spike. A catkin, that's kind of like a spike, except it droops over. And so might see that on like oak trees, or a lot of wind pollinated plants have catkins. You may also see umbels. It's kind of like an upside down umbrella. The Apiaceae family, so that's the dill and the carrot, that family, they have umbel-like flowers. You can also see sometimes heads, so that would be something like a sunflower, where you have lots of flowers clustered together. A spadix, that's a special kind of flower where like a peace lily has a spadix flower. Or the cyme over here, that would be something like a freesia. So lots and lots of different kinds of flower structures that exist out there and provide beauty to us. But again, their goal is pollination and reproduction. So when talking about flowers, we can also have monoecious and dioecious flowers. And so monoecious flowers, which is Greek for one house, those have male and female flowers on the same plant. And it may be in the same flower in the case of the lily here. So this is the pistil, where we have the female part and then the pollen producing stamens. So that's a monoecious where they're in the same flower. But a lot of times we'll see two monoecious where there are separate male and female flowers, but they're on the same plant. Now dioecious, that's two houses have male and female flowers on different plants. And so you can actually have a male plant or a female plant depending on their genetics. And so a couple examples of some monoecious flowers, plants where the flowers are separate. So corn, of course, the tassel on the top, that's the male part where it's producing the pollen. And then we have the silks there on the axillary bud, which is the female part and eventually produces the corn. And so basically in corn, you've got this it's wind pollinated. So that pollen drips down or falls down into that female part and fertilizes it to be corn. Also, this is an example of a cucurbit, which is, again, a watermelon or a squash, are going to have male and female flowers. And so you can tell the female there because of the swollen ovule. And kind of a fun thing too, if you're ever growing squash, typically for about the first 2 or 3 weeks after that plant begins to flower, it will only have male flowers. And the reason for that is that plant is sitting there trying to attract the bees and trying to attract pollinators to be able to know where that plant is. And then after some time, it will begin to produce the female flowers so that the bees are already used to coming to that spot, and they are all quickly able to pollinate those female flowers. And like I mentioned, we can also have dioecious, where there are separate male and female plants. So an example of this would be hollies. So only the female hollies produce berries. So if you're wanting those nice showy red berries, you would want to, typically with hollies, the variety name is going to be indicative of whether or not it's a male or female. So you want to be able to, if you want the berries, pick a female variety. But the challenge to keep in mind is that you can't have that berry development without the pollen. And so unless there are male hollies within the vicinity, you want to maybe either have both or at least know that within a relative square mile or so, there are some other hollies around. A Chinese pistache, a very common urban tree, is also a dioecious plant where we have male and female plants. With the with this one, I know a lot of people with trees in particular don't like to have the females because the females will produce berries and the berries will bring in birds and birds then bring in bird poop, which ends up typically on your car. And so, or just on the sidewalk or making a mess. And so a lot of people tend to plant more male trees in an urban setting to keep away from the mess. Now, I read a study a few years ago that the challenge there is that we've gotten so used to planting male trees specifically and not enough female trees that it's increased the pollen and thus increased allergies. And so something to keep in mind, just kind of the effects of our landscaping. But Chinese pistache is another example. Now, after we have that flower development, we want that fruit development. Those plants then do have to be pollinated. Of course, we tend to think of the pollinators, a very important group of animals and invertebrates that pollinate our plants and allow them to produce fruit and produce the next generation of plants. And so, of course, examples of that: bees, butterflies, moths, flies. Flies and beetles aren't as commonly recognized in the pollinator world, but they are also very important. Birds, like hummingbirds, can also be pollinators. Bats, not so much in our area, but in the tropics, are important pollinators. And we can also have wind and water pollinated plants as well. Now, if you're thinking like a plant and you're insect pollinated, you're going to want to be pretty showy, right? You're going to want to be pretty eye-catching for that insect to be able to notice you and then visit your flower. And so the example there on the left, that's a peach flower, is a very showy, beautiful, brings in the insects. Now on the right is, believe it or not, that's a flower. It's a grape flower. Grapes are wind pollinated, and so the wind's going to blow. So they don't really have to worry about trying to attract the wind in any way. So they may not have petals. They may not be very showy. They may be kind of small. You may not even notice them, but the wind does then carry that pollen and produce and pollinate those fruit. So after pollination occurs, we begin to get fruit. And so that's that ripened ovary or any associated parts with that plant. Of course, as you can imagine, like with flowers, there are lots of different types of fruit. We have stone fruit, palm fruit, citrus, all sorts of different fruit. But we can also have dry fruit. We don't always think about it. But things like an ochrapod, that's a dry fruit. And so I won't go into that as specifically, but there are lots of different types. I know someone had mentioned in the pre-assessment that they wanted some guidance on knowing when to pick vegetables or fruit when they're ready. I will say, just touch on that a little bit. It can be crop specific, and we will talk about that in the fourth webinar, which is the season success garden to grub, I believe it's called. But I did want to mention too that we can have climacteric and non-climacteric fruit. And so that's kind of something to keep in mind. And so climacteric fruit are fruits that will continue to ripen off of the vine. And so once they've started to ripen, you remove it from that plant and they will continue to ripen. So examples of that: the tomato, bananas, avocados, cantaloupe are also climacteric. And so those can all be picked pretty early once you see the onset of ripening. Now, other fruits The non-climacteric, so that's going to be things like watermelon, apples, I believe blueberries, blackberries, those are all non-climacteric fruits. You want them to be as ripe as possible when you go to harvest them. Strawberry would be another example. And so once you want to be able to harvest that once it looks like it's ready to be consumed. And so I'll touch on that just a little bit. The climacteric and the non-climacteric can be helpful when picking those fruit. And then to mention, I had an advisor when I was in school, and he told me one time that every plant's goal is to take over the world. And if you can figure out how that plant plans to take over the world, then you can really care for and maximize the potential of that plant. And so the example I like to use in particular are hot peppers. And so sometimes in the office, I'll get phone calls on, like, I'm growing jalapenos, but they're not hot, and I really would like some hot jalapenos. So what's going on there is that heat is created by the compound capsaicin, and that capsaicin is a defense mechanism. And so when the peppers are well taken care of, maybe they're being watered and fertilized, it's not very hot, they're not very stressed out, they're not as worried about protecting their young or their seeds because they've got plenty of time. They think that the world is fine. But then when things begin, when the weather heats up and they're not getting as much water, they're starting to stress, they're like, okay, I may die soon, so I need to put my energy into protecting my seeds, into my young. And so they begin to produce more capsaicin as a stress response. And so if you're growing jalapenos or some other hot pepper and they're not hot enough for you, you're taking too good care of your plants. And so roughen them up a little bit so that they're kind of stressed. Coconuts, of course, too, that's another example, how their fruit float. And so they can eventually float and begin to spread and land on various islands and spread throughout the through the world. And then milkweed too. So milkweed spreads its seeds. Lots of plants do this, but milkweed in particular, you'll notice those fluffy little bits, and that fluffy bit allows those plants to carry, or allows the wind to carry those seeds off and spread those seeds so that they can be further away from that mother plant and sprout and live their own life. So once that cycle ends and the seed ends up wherever it ends up, the cycle starts all over again. However, once that seed lands where it lands, we gotta hope, or that plant has to hope, that it's growing in a spot where it has good its specific growing requirements. And so its environmental conditions allow for that plant to be able to grow and go through that life cycle again. Which brings us to the next section of this webinar, which is favorable environmental conditions and what those plants need to be surrounded by in order to be successful in their life cycle. So I'll pause here briefly. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have any on what we just covered, I take a moment to pause and welcome those if you have any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any, but if you're still typing, I'll keep an eye on it, but I'm gonna keep moving right along. So again, so talking about favorable environmental conditions, going again back to elementary school science, what does a plant need? Throw it in the chat. What does a plant need in order to be happy and successful? Sun, water, yes. Light and water, soil, nutrients. Okay. Love, yes. Lots and lots of love. All right, so you guys mentioned them, light, air, water. One that wasn't necessarily mentioned, but temperature, or at least like a conducive temperature for that plant to be happy. And soil or nutrients. That's where we're getting, if you're growing hydroponically, of course, you don't have soil, but in that water solution, you have to have those nutrients. So we're going to go a little bit through these more specifically, and talk about some characteristics of these particular plant needs. So starting with light, all plants need some degree of sunlight. That's how photosynthesis happens. I'll sometimes get questions like, I've got a corner in the back of my yard that doesn't get any sunlight. What can I grow there? And the answer to that question, unfortunately, is mulch or rocks. You have to have some amount of sunlight in order for those plants to be able to grow. And so typically, if you are growing a plant, if you're shopping at the garden center, you'll see full sun or part sun, shade, full shade. So typically a full sun, that's gonna be about 6 to 8 hours. And then a part sun or part shade, that's about 3 to 6. And then a full shade plant really only needs about 2 hours of sun, or consistent dappled. So like if you're under a tree, some dappled sunlight. And so it's always a good idea if you're starting a new garden or moving into a new home, is really watch your yard and determine the areas that do receive light. We moved into a new home a couple years ago, and I broke my own rule and planted in some spots. And so I speak from experience. Try to have some patience and figure out the spots of your yard that may or may not be shady or maybe full sun. And then something also to keep in mind is that morning sun is a lot different than afternoon sun. And so if an area of your yard gets 2 hours of sunlight, but that's from 3 to 5 p.m., you're not going to want to put a full shade plant in that spot. That sun is too intense. So you would want to use probably something like a foliage type full sun plant in that spot. And so just be aware of that. Of course, too, Oklahoma sun is a bit different than Florida sun or North Carolina sun. And so just be aware. So from a temperature perspective, we may be able to grow something that they can grow in North Carolina, but then the sunlight here is far too intense for some of those plants. And so it just depends, and you may have to do a little bit of research on those plants. Now, air or atmosphere with those plants, there's not necessarily much we can do to change that for our plants, but just some things to keep in mind. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, and plants love nitrogen. So we'd think that's great, but plants aren't able to use atmospheric nitrogen. They have to receive nitrogen from the soil. So the exception are the legumes. And so that can include beans and peas or clover, alfalfa. Those are all legumes. They actually have a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria in the soil that allows them to convert atmospheric nitrogen. So super cool group of plants, but they're the only ones that can do it. Other plants, we have to supplement nitrogen through the soil. And so carbon dioxide, it's a very minor amount of our air. Of course, that is a crucial part of photosynthesis. And so they need that carbon dioxide, and then in combination with water, that's how they then create the sugar for their energy through the process of photosynthesis. Of course, the other byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, which we're thankful to plants for that because that's what we breathe. But plants also need oxygen too when they are respiring, and so through the process of respiration. And so that's really where they're using the sugar and the energy that they create through photosynthesis, and then they're breaking it down to be able to use that energy. So it's kind of like, yeah, if you want to think of photosynthesis as like, okay, I've got to go and I've got to get the food and prep the food, and then respiration is actually then eating the food. And so as they eat the sugars that they break down the sugar that they create through through photosynthesis, they release, or excuse me, they need oxygen for the process of respiration, and they release carbon dioxide in that process. So water, of course, was mentioned. We need water for our plants. That's an important one. We need it for them to remain alive. We need it for them to growth to occur, especially if we're growing anything with big juicy plant or big juicy fruit. Those plants are going to need quite a bit of water. If we don't have enough water, those plants can't grow efficiently, and we can have a reduced plant size and especially reduced fruit size. But we can also have too much water. So this is a picture of a tomato field that flooded, and you can kind of sort of see up to about 6 or 8 inches is where the water level was, because the soil stayed on those leaves. But what happens then is, again, we don't have oxygen in the soil. So those pores in the soil are filled up with water, and they don't have any oxygen. And so then the roots, they can become damaged, they begin to rot. And it can also encourage a lot of disease issues when we have way too much water in the soil. And so, especially if you're growing in the spring, or we have a particularly wet spring, you end up starting to see more diseases just because of all that availability of water, and also potential issues with some root rot. Now, if we go down to the cellular level, I won't quiz anybody on their plant cell organelles, but a couple things I want to point out, particularly here, is the vacuole. And so we, as animals, we do not have vacuoles in our cells, but plants do. And what it is basically is a giant balloon used for storage in that plant cell. And so as it pulls up water, it can store nutrients, it can store sugars. And so as it's storing those and as it's happy, that balloon then is full. And it pushes on the cell walls, and it allows that plant to be nice and rigid and have a good structure. Now, what happens if that balloon begins to deflate, begins to empty, and we don't have that pressure, which we call turgor pressure? That's the scientific term. But if we don't have that turgor pressure and the balloon begins to deflate, what happens? Our plants will. So that's what happens on the cellular level when you see wilted leaves or anything like that, when your plants don't have that nice structure. You're going to notice the same thing in like if you have a salad mix in the back of your fridge. As those leaves begin to wilt, they're no longer attached to a water source via roots. So they have a limited amount of water in them until they begin to lose that water and begin to wilt. And so having those vacuoles full of water allows for that nice structure, nice like tautness of those plants. Now, talking about temperature, vegetable crops and all plants, I should say, have specific ranges for germination and plant growth and fruit maturation, and also maybe quality and flavor development of the fruit. And so sometimes these temperature requirements can be different at different stages. And so typically, plants can tolerate a bit lower temperature for germination, especially our cool season veggies or cool season plants can handle those lower temperatures. So to go to the next slide, you can see here that some of the lowest, so this to kind of go over this graph, we have a minimum soil temperature for seed germination. We have an optimum soil temperature for seed germination and a maximum, and then also a range as well. And so things like spinach and peas, and I think beets are a particularly cool season. They can germinate as low as 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we can start those pretty soon. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, we can get out there and start planting those seeds. Now, the challenge is that may be outside of our optimum range. And if it's outside of our optimum range, then we may start to notice things like they're a bit slower to germinate, or it may not be as even as they germinate. And so we want to aim for the optimum range, but we can also push it down to the minimum if you want to go ahead and get started. Some examples too. So this is ambient temperature for different vegetables. Again, a minimum, a maximum, and an optimum range. And you can see here kind of and about halfway through, that's where we start to see the distinction between what we would consider our cool season veggies and our warm season veggies. But one thing that I really want to point out is that we may have a warm season veggie, but its preferred maximum temperature may only be 80 degrees. If you're in Oklahoma, how many days in the 80s do we have in the summertime? Not that many. It's pretty lucky if we get an 80-degree day in July. So keep in mind things like tomatoes and peppers or cucumbers, particularly these peppers and these tomatoes, they may not like, they may be a warm season veggie, but they may not like our July and August temperatures. So something just to keep in mind as you're growing those plants. Of course, we can break down our plants by seasonal classification. And so kind of as I mentioned, we can have a cool season or we can have a warm season. Cool season, we're kind of entering the cool season time period here, and it ventures into spring, sort of like in early May. And then in early May, we get to our warm season, and we can have that in through the fall, where we are presented with another cool season in Oklahoma. Excuse me. But thing to keep in mind, Oklahoma and other places as well, they do not follow a calendar as far as weather and temperatures go. Our last freeze here in Cleveland County was, I think, November 28th. It was towards the end of November where we finally got a freeze. And so we had a very long fall. It was kind of nice. But we can have a very short fall. We can have late spring freezes. And so the last average last freeze date in central Oklahoma is April 15th. But we've had freezes as late as May 2nd, May 3rd. And so it's always a gamble. It can be unpredictable. It's the joy of gardening. It always keeps you on your toes. But when also talking about plants, we can also talk about hardiness. And so that's really sort of how well they're able to handle our cool season. And so that can help us determine which plants do well in our area. And that's great. So something definitely you want to keep that in mind when you're out shopping and looking for plants, but something also to keep in mind are microclimates. And so we may have areas in our yard where we get a lot of south wind in the winter time, or maybe I have this particular issue where I have an area that's fairly shaded, but it is up against a brick wall. And so putting shade plants in that spot, it's really too hot and it really fries those plants regardless of it being in the shade. And so kind of keep that in mind as you're selecting plants, that sometimes hardiness, there's more to the picture than just our USDA hardiness zone. So the USDA hardiness zone map, actually, I believe they updated this year, and I don't think I updated my graph. But that's okay. We're still really in that 7A, 7B cusp in zone here in central Oklahoma. So when you're going to shop at the nurseries, you want to make sure that you're getting plants that are hardy up to at least zone 7. Now, the thing to keep in mind is not all the time do garden centers have sell plants that are hardy to our area. And so definitely want to look at that plant label and make sure it's not a zone 8 or zone 9, because those are going to be better suited for maybe Central Texas or South Texas. Or if you have an area that's very well protected and has a warmer microclimate, maybe up against a brick wall, it may do okay there. So just something to keep in mind. Now, if you remember 2021, we had that horrible freeze in February. That was a zone 5 freeze. And so we lost a lot of plants because it was not necessarily our average or typical for this area. So things like that can happen. And so I apologize, I didn't update this, but if you're in central Oklahoma, we're pretty solidly now in that 7B area, but still in 7. And so we can also classify, so this is sort of classifying plants by their seasonal characteristics and their hardiness, but we can also classify plants by their life cycle. And so we can have annual, biennial, and perennial plants as well. So an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in 1 year, and a perennial is a plant that completes its life cycle over multiple years. Now a biennial is one that completes its cycle in 2 years, but it's really like a fall through spring. It needs that cold period. So it's 2 calendar years, but it's not necessarily, or it's over 2 calendar years, but not necessarily 2 exact calendar years. And so typically with a biennial, it'll put out a rosette, kind of here with our ornamental cabbage in the fall. And then after it goes through that cold period, it will bolt and send up a flower stalk. And then after that, it will begin to die and end its life cycle. Now, thing to keep in mind, annuals are plants that can complete their life cycle in 1 year. But sometimes we have annual plants that reseed themselves very prolifically. And so we may plant them in the garden, but they keep coming back. And that may be from the seed that they're dispersing into the garden. So they're annual, but they may become perennially present in our garden. It's just the next generation. Now perennials too, those are plants that their life cycle can occur over multiple years, but that's if they're hardy to our zone. And so you can go to the garden center and buy a lot of tropical plants, hibiscus, things like that. Those would be perennial if they were in their native environment, but they're pretty much annuals where we have them, because we can only have them for a season. They're not hardy where we're at. So keep in mind, a plant can be botanically perennial, but annual in your environment. We can also plant things to keep in mind with different plants is that different plants can also have different environmental factors that trigger flowering. And so with lettuce, as the temperatures begin to get warmer, it will bolt and send up a flower stalk. And so that's what triggers flowering. Kale is a biennial. And so as it goes, if you plant it in the fall and keep it through the winter and have it in the spring, then it will begin to flower after it experiences that cold temperature. And then spinach, what triggers its flowering is day length. And so even if we have a nice cool spring that lasts all the way through June, our days getting longer are going to encourage flowering in spinach. So different environmental triggers can trigger different can trigger flowering in different plants. Excuse me. And then, so our last plant need and a little bit of a teaser for next week. So soil and nutrients. And so with soil, it's kind of a trade-off. If you have sandy soil, so that's a very large particle. Sandy soils have very good drainage. Water is able to move through that very quickly, but they have very low fertility. And so you may have to supplement with more nutrients in that sandy soil. Now, clay, which is what we have predominantly in our area, you either have like very heavy clay soil or very sandy soil in our area. But a lot of it, more of it's the clay. But it's very poor drainage. So clay is a very, very small particle. And so it takes water a long time to move through that soil profile. But clay is a very fertile soil. It's able to hold on to nutrients and is able to you don't have to fertilize quite as often in a clay soil. And so ideally, if we were choosing what kind of soil we inherited in our gardens, you would want somewhere in the middle with like a loam or a sandy loam or silt loam, somewhere in the middle of that kind of trade-off area. We'd also want to have about 2 to 3% organic matter. And so organic matter is all the decomposed material within your soil. And so things that have broken down over time. And it really sort of acts as the muscle of the soil and can really help with a lot of challenging soils by adding more organic matter. And we'll talk a lot more about that next week. But you want to avoid soils that are rocky, very heavy clay, or very shallow topsoil. Anything with poor drainage, or if you know that there was an issue where maybe some kind of herbicide, long-lasting herbicide was sprayed, that can cause some issues. But of course, the challenge is that if we're moving into a home or somewhere new, we don't always get to choose our soils necessarily. And so that can sometimes be a challenge. And if you have a soil that is challenging and you're not able to really grow in that space, then raised beds and containers can really, really help with that. And so building that soil up and creating a layer of soil where that soil is good can really help with a lot of those soil issues. And I have mostly pictures of vegetables on here, but if you're looking to have more ornamentals, absolutely growing in containers and building that soil up to at least about 6 inches or so can be a good measure when your options are limited. And so I will wrap up. I just want to point out a couple of resources, particularly the OSU fact sheet website. So you can go to this website here and search for any gardening topic. And it will pull up all publications by OSU about that particular topic. And so it's a great place if you're looking for more information and then just some relevant fact sheets for related to what we talked about tonight. There's a basic plant care, and so all over those plant needs and things to consider. The Oklahoma Garden Planting Guide is a great one for veggies and then planting trees and shrubs. So just a couple to consider if you want some more information. And so with that, I will pause again. I don't see any residual questions in the chat, but if you have anything you want to ask, let me know. And I will, I did record this session, so I'll send out a link if you want to rewatch it, and I'll also send out a PDF of the PowerPoint if you want to go back and review. And I hope that you will join us next week for dishing some garden dirt, and we will talk all about the wonderful world of soils. Easy. Okay. I'm seeing a couple questions. So will the meeting be the same time and day next week? Yes, we are on Thursdays at 5:30. And easiest flower to grow in Oklahoma. Okay, quite a few. And I know someone said that they had full confidence in gardening and 15+ years of experience. So if you have suggestions, then throw them in the chat, but I'm going to throw in things like cosmos. Cosmos are very easy to grow. Periwinkles, if you're buying bedding plants, they're not quite as easy to start by seed, but if you're growing, they love the heat. Pentas, I'm throwing out all annuals, but then also if you're looking for perennials, things like echinacea or rudbeckia, but really kind of looking for those native type plants, you're going to have quite a bit more success. And zinnia, yeah, thank you. Yeah, zinnias are crazy easy. And yes, if you are registered, so the question is, will you send a link to a recording if you can't make the class? Yes, if you registered for that particular class on the Google form or the Microsoft form, I will send you the recording. And if you're not sure if you registered it for it because you are not sure if if you didn't click it because you weren't available, just go ahead and fill that Microsoft form out again. That way I've got your email when I go through it. How hard is it to grow wisteria? Wisteria is pretty easy and can sometimes be a little aggressive. You want to give it a structure to grow on, otherwise it will find a structure to grow on, and that might be a tree or a water spout or something you don't want it to grow on. Yeah, it's not hard to grow wisteria. I would just give it a structure and keep in mind that it can sometimes need a little bit of a haircut. Okay, Darlene asked if tomatoes become more prolific when stressed, like bushing the plant. Tomatoes, I guess it depends on the type of stress, but tomatoes are very sensitive to outside of their temperature ranges, and that's a particular passion project of mine. But I would not say necessarily they don't become, I wouldn't, tomatoes are a bit of a diva. They don't really like to be stressed out. But if you're talking about thinning them, like, because I said like bushing them, I wouldn't necessarily bush a tomato plant, but if you're thinning them, that can help with airflow for disease prevention. If I answered your question. Okay. I don't see any Susan, have I missed any questions in the chat? Nope, we're all good. Okay. All right. Without seeing any more questions, I hope to see you all next week and have a lovely rest of your evening.